The Panama Canal no longer looks like the backbone of world shipping. More and more, it resembles a bottleneck that could start choking from its own traffic at any moment. Ships line up in queues, and any disruption instantly ripples through prices worldwide. And right at this moment, neighboring Colombia is making a move that would have sounded like pure sci-fi just a few years ago. It plans to cut straight through the Andes and build a new 137-mile transit corridor that could redirect ships previously dependent on Panama. This isn't just a highway, and it's not just a railway. It's a hybrid route where ships and trains become part of the same system, pumping global cargo from ocean to ocean. The engineering challenge is immense. Mountains, tropical climate, unstable soils, humidity, and fault lines, and all of it for the sake of a route estimated to cost between $7 and $13 billion. Sounds impressive, but there's a catch. The question isn't whether the country can pull it off. The real question is what happens if it does. Let's break it down. Colombia's big problems. Colombia is a country with an economic pulse that beats in sync with world prices for oil and coal. In 2023, these two commodities accounted for 47% of all merchandise exports, nearly half. That's enormous. It's not just an important sector, it's the bedrock that shapes the behavior of the entire economy. But oil and coal also introduce chronic instability into the system. Any correction on the commodity markets hits Colombia immediately. The peso weakens, budgets tighten, public projects stall. The core issue is simple. The economy functions poorly without that income. Meanwhile, global demand is changing. Oil is becoming a resource with an increasingly unpredictable trajectory. Sudden spikes, sharp drops, and growing pressure from the energy transition. And that transition's real. Countries are committing to phase-outs. Companies are rethinking investments. Consumers want clean supply chains. For Colombia, this is a looming disaster. And in the middle of all this, there's a bizarre contradiction that Colombians rarely discuss openly, even though it warrants front-page attention. A nation with access to two oceans, direct exposure to Asia, US, Europe shipping routes, and a strategic position between North and South barely earns anything from transit or logistics. It feels like a design flaw, but it's the actual state of things. Logistics and transport services make up only a small share of GDP. The ports function, but they aren't regional hubs. Cargo flows pass nearby without stopping. Meanwhile, Panama has turned its logistics sector and Canal into a stable source of income. Mexico leveraged its location to become a manufacturing corridor plugged into global value chains. These nations profit handsomely from geography alone. And you know what makes Colombia feel even more like it's missing something? The neighboring Panama Canal can be crippled by something as simple as drought. One of the world's most critical routes is shockingly vulnerable. Water levels in Lake Gatun drop, capacity shrinks, and tankers and container ships pile up in queues at both ends. So what happens if Colombia tried to compete and takes a slice of Panama's business? That alone would transform the country's economic future, and this is exactly where an idea begins. One that not long ago seemed outright impossible. Connecting the two oceans. Talks about linking the Pacific and the Caribbean by rail first appeared in the late 2000s and early 2010s. Back then, it was mostly an exercise in strategic thinking. Newspapers occasionally quoted officials promising to look into it, but the concept never progressed beyond presentations. Political instability, shifting priorities, and a shortage of funding, the usual cocktail that quietly kills megaprojects, kept it from moving forward. But after 2022, the topic unexpectedly started making a comeback. At first, it tiptoed in. Research discussions about bringing the railways back to life so the country wouldn't stay hostage to its roads. Then it grew louder. The government rolled out a sweeping transport reform. On that wave, by 2023 to 2024, the Interoceanic Corridor returned to public debate. No longer a daring what if, but a project that might actually happen. Then in 2025, something unprecedented happened. The government officially opened a tender for a full feasibility study. That was the moment the project ceased being a dream and became a formal process. Paperwork, deadlines, budgets, consultants, everything you'd expect from a bona fide megaproject. The idea is nothing if not ambitious, a rail line linking the Pacific with the Caribbean, built to move large volumes of freight and function as a standalone logistics backbone. Different versions explored routes tied to Pacific ports, including Jorado, with links to Caribbean ports such as Turbo, Anguilla, or Tichamate. There's still no final decision on the route, but one thing's already clear. Its length will be roughly 137 miles. And of course, the projected capacity has already been outlined. Preliminary estimates put it at around 25 million tons of cargo per year. That's a substantial figure, putting the project in the same league as the region's biggest infrastructure undertakings, with a matching price range of $7 to $13 billion, as the project documents note. On paper, the corridor is more than just a railway. It includes modernizing or building port facilities, creating transfer terminals, and integrating with the country's internal logistics network. Essentially, the goal is to build an entirely new transport system, not merely lay rails across the country. Meanwhile, the project is moving forward alongside a broader push to reactivate Colombia's rail system. The government is revitalizing old lines and building new ones. Thus, the transoceanic line is taking on increasingly clear contours. One high-profile example is the La Dorada-Chiriguana corridor, handed over as a public-private partnership and already showing real results. In just the first 9 months of 2025, it carried nearly 800,000 tons of cargo, which is 3 times more than in the previous year. It's a strong sign that Colombia's railways are coming back to life and could serve as a backbone for the future interoceanic route. Alongside this, existing port infrastructure will be upgraded depending on the final alignment. The plan includes modern equipment, automated cranes, efficient cargo handling machinery, improved access roads, and much more. The main goal is to make the coastal hubs capable of handling and turning around large vessels such as container ships. Right now, Colombia is collecting data, conducting environmental assessments, testing route options, and discussing financing. International engineering firms are entering the picture with models and proposals. The pace is slow, but for the first time, it's systematic. It's also worth noting that Colombia isn't the only country interested in the project. China's watching this Colombian endeavor closely. In August 2025, representatives of China Civil Engineering Construction met with Colombia's infrastructure agency. Another group of 34 Chinese companies joined a business roundtable in Bogota to discuss Colombian rail projects, including the Interoceanic Corridor. All this shows the project is no longer a theoretical exercise, it's edging closer to becoming reality. And when it does, Colombia and its neighbors will feel the groundbreaking changes. Economic revolution. First of all, this project gives Colombia a real opportunity to step back from its long-standing reliance on hydrocarbons. The corridor would become a crucial land bridge between the Pacific and Atlantic, effectively connecting Asia, the U.S., and a wide range of global markets. If you look at what goods are currently carried through the Panama Canal and in which directions, it becomes clear what this new Colombian route could be capable of. What's in it for Colombia? The country would transform into a key hub of global trade, not just a place sitting somewhere near the vital Panama Canal. And this isn't only about influence or prestige. There's also a very tangible benefit: money. For example, Panama Canal revenue in 2025 reached $5.7 billion. The Colombian route won't work as smoothly. Container ships will need to unload. Cargo must be moved to the railway and then loaded again. It's not as easy as sailing through a canal. But even if just a portion, say 10% of Panama's traffic shifts to Colombia, the annual income could reach hundreds of millions or even several $billion. Besides, Colombia itself will find it far easier to ship its goods abroad and receive imports. That's one of the reasons the national economy would grow. Domestic logistics will also become more efficient. Moving a container from the country's interior to the Caribbean coast currently costs around $2,450. By rail, those expenses could drop to about $1,800, nearly a 25% savings. This instantly makes Colombian products more competitive, attracts new investments, and encourages the development of industrial zones along the route. The corridor would create an entirely new logistics system, allowing cargo to move not on overloaded highways, but on a railway designed for heavy volumes and steady flow. That means fewer traffic jams, less vehicle damage, and shorter travel times. For local businesses, that means quicker shipping for the government, additional revenue from transit and logistics services, warehouses, terminals, and industrial clusters could emerge along the railway, and the jobs won't just appear during construction, they'll remain throughout the system's operation, from terminal staff to logistics specialists. But the impact won't be limited to Colombia. The global economy, which currently relies heavily on the Panama Canal, would gain an alternative route. The canal is overloaded, facing queues, tonnage limits, and weather-related delays. These issues affect everyone working with container shipping. A Colombian route could relieve some of that pressure. Goods from Asia headed to North or South America would move faster, bypassing bottlenecks. Companies could plan shipments more accurately and rely less on chance or unexpected disruptions. For global trade, this is a new path that makes supply chains more resilient. And don't forget China. Chinese investment's almost a natural next step. For China, it's not just about putting money somewhere. It's an opportunity to reduce reliance on the Panama Canal and speed up the delivery of its goods to the Americas. The country's eager to cut logistics costs and delivery times, and the new corridor gives it a direct route across the continent. Chinese companies could take part in construction, manage terminals, or operate the railway. For Colombia, that means financing, technology, and international backing, the kind that can push the project from the planning stage into real infrastructure. However, all of this will matter only if the Colombian corridor has no serious competitors aside from the Panama Canal, and there could be many. Nearly every country in Central America is a potential rival with its own multi-billion-dollar mega project on the drawing board. Self-destruction of a rival. Not far from Colombia and Panama in Central America lies a country called Nicaragua. Its geography is also perfect for creating a route that could change both the country's economy and the balance of global trade. Naturally, Nicaragua understood this and spent decades thinking about its own interoceanic canal. The idea kept fading away and resurfacing again, but things really heated up in 2013 when Daniel Ortega's government signed an agreement with Chinese businessman Wang Jing, who promised to pour tens of billions of dollars into a nearly 171-mile waterway, an alternative to the Panama Canal. The map of the future canal looked like a long, open gash cutting from the Atlantic across swamps, villages, grazing lands, and Lake Nicaragua, the largest freshwater body in Central America. The canal was meant to become a corridor, able to handle enormous ships, the kind of bulky giants that feel cramped in the Panama Canal even after its 2016 expansion. For Nicaragua, this wasn't just another development plan. It was a chance to escape chronic poverty, shattered roads, weak exports, and constant dependence on foreign loans. The authorities promised up to 50,000 construction jobs, GDP growth, new ports, railways, free trade zones, and a sense that a small nation of 6 million was stepping onto the global stage. Those who lived along the proposed route remember that year as a time of cautious optimism. Villages buzzed with talk about land payments, new schools, paved roads, and jobs. People tuned into rare radio broadcasts to hear about $40 billion in new investment and promises to turn Nicaragua into a new trade axis between the two oceans. The promise of change hung in the air along with a quiet unease. Yet the more ambitious the rhetoric became, the more obvious it was that the project ran straight into one of the region's most delicate ecosystems. Lake Nicaragua is a place where the water lies flat like glass, with only the faint shadows of fish and a little suspended silt beneath the surface. When talk began about a canal that would cut Nicaragua in two, the first thing to quiver wasn't the economy or politics, it was the lake's silence. That quiet was shattered by figures. A future passage roughly 92 feet deep, close to 918 feet wide, drawn as a straight slash through Central America's biggest freshwater basin with nearly 35 trillion cubic feet of water. Engineers estimated that to carve a canal through the lake, they would need to dredge hundreds of millions of cubic feet of sediment. The silt here is thick with plant debris, volcanic particles, and delicate organics. Once disturbed, it would turn the water murky. Scientists cautiously warned the resulting darkness could cut sunlight levels by 2- or 3-fold, destroying underwater plants and causing fish populations to flee or collapse. The lake feeds communities and supports surrounding wetlands and forests, home to over 100 bird species. When the word salinization first appeared in the calculations, many simply refused to acknowledge it. But the canal was meant to link the Pacific and the Caribbean, and salt water would inevitably find its way in. Even a tiny amount, 1 or 2 parts per thousand, could wipe out freshwater species. Experience with other canals has shown alien water always finds a path. Beyond environmentalists, locals were alarmed too. By some estimates, 30,000 to 100,000 people could be displaced. Several villages lay directly on the proposed route, and families woke each day wondering if the land their ancestors lived on for generations would soon be under an excavator's bucket. Meanwhile, the promised billions began to evaporate before everyone's eyes. After China's stock market crash in 2015, Wang Jing's fortune was nearly cut in half, and all talk of solid financing sank into silence. Not a single major bank was willing to invest in a project with such enormous risks. By 2016, it was clear that construction had stalled. The sites of the future ports were empty lots, the planned locks sat in silence. Engineers came and went, but little visible work was done. People in villages admitted that the project had died before it was even born. In 2018, HKND quietly shut down its offices, the documents vanished, phones went silent, and the grand promises crumbled into dust on the rural roads. People who'd hoped for jobs went back to what they always did, repairing boats, running small shops, farming. The canal faded into legend without leaving so much as a single slab of concrete behind. The final point came in 2024, when Nicaragua's parliament officially revoked the concession. On paper, the project ended then, but in reality, it had died long before. So in the end, Nicaragua poses no real threat to Colombia and its interoceanic corridor. The real challenge comes from Mexico and its massive mega project. Panama Canal's key rival. The Mexican interoceanic corridor of the Isthmus of Tehuantepec is one of those projects that spent decades in the shadows, only to suddenly draw the attention of global logistics players. It's often called a competitor to the Panama Canal, although in reality it's a completely different model. Not a waterway, but a land-based corridor, similar to the concept in Colombia, built around a roughly 191-mile rail line, 2 major ports, and a network of industrial clusters. And all of it sits at the narrowest point of Mexico, where the distance between the 2 oceans is so small that using it as a strategic shortcut starts to look like common sense. What seems like a brand new mega project actually has a long backstory. The railway here has existed for more than a century, but for most of its life it was only partially functional or not in service at all. Only in recent years has the corridor been given a second chance. Modernization, new investment, reconstruction of 82 bridges and nearly 300 drainage structures, work that few would have dared to call a priority even a decade ago. Today, it's part of a multi-billion-dollar infrastructure push, where a price tag of $2 to $3 billion is more of a starting point than a final estimate. The core of the system is that 191-mile route, connecting Salina Cruz on the Pacific and Coatzacoalcos on the Gulf of Mexico. Since its official relaunch in December 2023, the line has already carried over 63,000 passengers and around 316,000 tons of cargo. These aren't record-breaking numbers, but they show that the corridor is operating, not just living inside PowerPoint slides. At the same time, another line branches eastward, an almost 192-mile stretch toward Palenque, where traffic is also moving, more than 19,000 passengers and roughly 29,000 tons of freight since the opening. Altogether, the rail network now exceeds 745 miles, giving the corridor a flexibility it simply didn't have before. The second cornerstone of the project is its ports. For decades, Coatzacoalcos and Salina Cruz were tied mostly to bulk and raw materials, but their status is shifting under the Corridor Initiative. In 2022 alone, Coatzacoalcos handled about 34.4 million tons of cargo, while Salina Cruz about 8.6 million. What matters, however, is the potential. After upgrades, their combined container capacity could reach 1.4 million TEU per year. For comparison, it's still far from giants like the Port of Los Angeles, but enough to make the corridor a meaningful link between Asia, the US, and Latin America. Still, it's important to understand that becoming a true alternative to the Panama Canal requires more than laying tracks from coast to coast. The Panama Canal provides seamless vessel transit with no cargo transfers. A land corridor adds steps, unloading a ship, loading onto a train, unloading again, and reloading onto another vessel. Each stage requires time, money, and coordination. Because of that, the corridor won't suit every type of cargo, but for shipments where speed and reliability matter most, it can become a compelling alternative. On long routes such as Asia-US, the ship-train-ship model can in some cases beat the classic Panama Passage, followed by sailing up the US coast. In certain scenarios, the corridor could shave off several days. And in logistics, a few days can translate into millions. The project is still far from its final form. Infrastructure is expanding, capacity is growing, investors are watching carefully. But one thing is already clear: Mexico is serious, and work on the ground is very real. It's one of the most significant logistics projects in the Western Hemisphere, fitting neatly into a world where countries are increasingly focused on backup routes, flexibility, and resilient supply chains. Projects you've never heard of. This is Honduras, a country that has long clung stubbornly and persistently to the idea that one day it might leverage its geography as boldly as Panama did, or as Colombia and Mexico are trying to do now. The country is narrow, the distances are short, and on the map everything looks almost perfect. A Caribbean coastline with a major trading hub of Puerto Cortes, and a relatively short route to the Pacific. This simple geography has tempted politicians and advisors for decades to imagine their own dry canal. In reality, though, things have proven far more complicated. Honduras' railway system was historically fragmented and built not for interoceanic transit, but for the needs of banana companies. At its peak, the total track length reached around 435 miles, but it consisted of scattered narrow-gauge lines that didn't even connect the north and south of the country, let alone offer a route between the two oceans. The country faces two major obstacles. First, it has no full-fledged railway running across its territory. Second, Honduras' Pacific coast isn't actually open ocean at all, but a narrow inlet leading into the Gulf of Fonseca. To turn this area into a functioning transit hub, the country would need a deep water port capable of handling large container ships. That's an expensive, ambitious, and inevitably political undertaking. Even so, Honduras periodically revisits the idea of an interoceanic railway. In 2024 to 2025, the government again discussed building a line linking the Caribbean port of Puerto Castilla with a future Pacific port at Impala. The investment proposals were valued at several $1 billion, which is an enormous figure for a country whose economy barely exceeds $30 billion. Even if foreign backers were on board, Honduras would still have to tackle logistics, land allocation, port upgrades, security, and long-term political stability. These are precisely the areas where the country has historically struggled. There's undeniable potential: short distances, a strategically placed gateway into Central America, and a growing Caribbean port. But turning the project into reality requires a strong, stable, long-term investment strategy, something Honduras simply doesn't have yet. As a result, the country remains a land of unrealized potential, a place where the dry canal exists on blueprints rather than on the ground. Guatemala's trajectory is more orderly, though not without contradictions. Geographically, the country is positioned in such a way that a transport corridor between the Atlantic and the Pacific seems perfectly logical. Guatemala has two well-known ports: Puerto Barrios on the Caribbean and Port Quetzal on the Pacific. The distance between them is relatively small, and the infrastructural logic has been obvious for decades. As early as the mid-20th century, proposals for an overland corridor were discussed, and the first major railway modernization projects appeared. Nothing truly large-scale ever materialized. Guatemala's main problem is that its railway network fell into disrepair after the 1990s. The country once operated roughly 620 miles of track, but much of it's now abandoned or dismantled. For several years, the government had been discussing a revival of the rail system, from freight lines and upgrades to port-to-port corridors, and even proposals backed by foreign investors. Every so often, billion-dollar plans surface, but they rarely progress beyond a memorandum stage. Guatemala does have one major advantage. Quetzal, its Pacific port, is considered one of the most developed and busiest in the region, and its Caribbean ports continue to expand steadily. In other words, the country already has both destinations of a dry canal, but the middle route, whether railway or a high-speed highway, simply doesn't exist. As in Honduras, everything comes down to the enormous investment and political stability required for such a massive interoceanic project, and Guatemala has long struggled with both. Still, the prospects here look a bit more realistic. First, the economy of Guatemala is larger. Second, the ports are already integrated into major trade networks. Third, the country is actively trying to revive its rail sector and attract new logistics investors. But even in the best-case scenario, Guatemala probably won't emerge as a rival to Panama on the same level as Mexico and Colombia, which means it's those three nations that will ultimately compete for the title of the world's key trade corridors.